So, we've heard today from two of our speakers about the importance of leadership. The MEC has spoken about leadership and management being a key strategic driver of GDEs. And Godwin also spoke about the NDP and the way in which it emphasizes that principals need to provide leadership on the curriculum. But I'm going to argue that in the South African context, the school principal is something of a marginalized figure. And the focus has been too much on the managerial competence of the school leader and not enough on the leadership competence of the school leader. But let me take a step back and talk about why it is that the school leader is such an important figure. And I'm going to start with a quote from the Stanford University's Hoover Institution, who say our results indicate that highly effective principals raise the achievement of a typical student in their schools by between 2 and 7 months of learning in a single school year. Ineffective principals lower achievement by the same amount. And that's really the starting point, is the idea that the principal is the key lever of change in the school. And as I said to you earlier, I think that the key role of the school principal has been neglected to some extent in South Africa. And we've seen a lot of policy and investments that have focused on broad curriculum reform, on teacher development, on the allocation of physical infrastructure. And as I said just now, many of the principal programs that we've seen have been focused on the managerial skills of school principals. But, I think that it's true to say that principals face very particular and difficult challenges in the context in which we're working. Now, what are those challenges? Well, first of all, there's the context of poverty and community conflict that so many of our schools are in. We've also got policy shifts, and there's a sort of incessant pressure to change in the system. The ongoing drive for results, so, the responsibility to drive school improvement, to drive good results. There's a very, very strong data and assessment focus in our schools. The principal has to mediate school, community, and district requirements, and I think that's also a difficult task on its own. The school itself is something of a democratic institution, which is having to work with the community, the parent body, the school governing body, and so on. And yet the district is a very hierarchical structure, and actually for the principal to stand between those two structures and mediate on the one hand the demographic institution of the school and the hierarchical institution of the district on the other hand is a difficult task. Teacher unions remain a difficult thing for principals to have to deal with. I think it's also true to say that principals are isolated. So by definition, a teacher exists in a community of practice. Teachers work in a community of teachers in a school, but the principal stands as an isolated figure, as the leader of the institution, often alone. And we've seen again and again principals with low self-esteem, and this is reported and indicated in research that there is a prevailing low self-esteem among principals in the system. I think there's also a case to be made for the fact that the role of principals has changed in the system in South Africa. This is a quote from the NEDU report of 2013, where they say a decade ago most principals saw themselves as administrators and accounting officers and generally left teachers to their own devices. In contrast, in the schools that were visited by NEDU evaluators in 2012, evaluators found a growing awareness among principals of the importance of instructional leadership and of their own responsibilities to lead the learning programs in the school. Another quote from the same report, it's the responsibility of the principal to lead curriculum delivery. While tasks and responsibilities should be formally distributed to members of the school management team and teachers, the principal must direct the overall strategy. And I think those quotes from NEDU are instructive. There's a role that the principal needs to be able to play in South African education today, which is about instructional leadership. It's no longer sufficient for the school principal to be a managerial leader. The school principal needs to be the leader of instruction and what's happening at the level of the instructional core. So, hence, the model that Bridge has developed, which is a model that works directly with school principals. We heard yesterday from Ken Bryan that educational work relies on relationship and context, and that's exactly what we're doing with communities of practice, where we are ensuring that there's greater relationship amongst groups of principals, and we're working with those principals in their own context. So with Bridge, we work with geographically proximate principals. So I'll give you an example of one of the groups that we've been working with. It's in Ekurhuleni North here in Gauteng. The areas of Actonville and Wattville, we're working with a group of 10 primary schools in Ekurhuleni North, and we're working with the principals of those primary schools, not the deputies, not the heads of department, but the principals themselves. And we're holding monthly meetings with those principals and doing facilitated work, focusing on reflective practice, focusing on ensuring greater levels of collaboration and relationship among those principals, focused on driving higher levels of trust, focused on ensuring that their joint tasks that are undertaken, and that ultimately the effectiveness of what's happening at the level of teaching and learning is enhanced in those schools. Now, our model has evolved over time. We've learned from other communities of practice. For example, there's a very compelling community of practice in the Western Cape called the Grasslow community. It's been around for more than 10 years and evolved out of the Safe Schools campaign. That's a strong, robust community of practice where we've learned many of our lessons. But what I can say is that we've seen real impact in the communities of practice that we've worked with, like this Ekurhuleni North one. So we've seen the development of trust and common purpose. We've seen shared visions and values. We've seen links beyond the school level, so principals no longer working in their own situations, but actually linking with colleagues and peers in other schools in the area. The sharing of resources as well as the sharing of learnings and working practice has happened. There have been collaborations and partnerships. There's been the taking of collective responsibility. There's also been ongoing reflective inquiry, which has led to instructional improvements in the schools. And hence there's been the modelling of collaboration and reflective practice for teachers to learn from, and which then echoes throughout the school system. So just to pause briefly and tell you again about the Ekurhuleni North community of practice so that I can situate what I'm saying in context. The Ekurhuleni North community of practice began with the principals having very little to do with each other. Historically, Wattville and Actonville had, because of socioeconomic and race divisions, had little to do with each other. And almost immediately, once they started working together as a community of practitioners, they started doing things like attending district meetings together and developing relationships amongst them. Then they started sharing resources. They started doing joint fundraising initiatives. They started purchasing things together. That kind of thing happened quite quickly. We've been working with them for 3 years now, and by year 3, we started to see real impact at the level of what's happening in instruction, in teaching and learning. So to give you an example of that, this year, they undertook a maths diagnostic test. They'd heard from all of the senior schools that they feed that there were real problems with the maths capacity of learners. And so what they did at the beginning of this year, if they tested every grade 7 learner who just left their schools and was going into grade 8 in the senior schools, they did a diagnostic test on them. And they learned through the diagnostic test what the common issues were across all their schools, but also what the individual issues were per school regarding maths teaching and learning. And as a group of principals, they've instituted a professional development strategy that they're rolling out with their teachers to make sure that their teachers improve in the areas where there have been these deficiencies. So through collaboration and coordinated effort, they've seen real impact. I think the key learning for us has been that individual improvement comes with peer engagement and support. It's in the community where the prevailing conditions for individual improvement are set.